Hello to our viewers and to all the people in the studio. Our participation in the social media is increasing all the time, and we're seeing that everything is brought to the extreme on the social media, and we will see how the social media has become a platform that contributes to a discourse of rifting and division. We've seen shaming, offensive discourse, even families, and we are now in the middle of our fourth election campaign, and we want to understand who gains from that. What price are we paying? What price is Israeli democracy playing? And where will this lead us? And if we have doubts about what the public thinks about the social media as a catalyst for creating division and polarization, let's look at the following figures from the ADL survey. Regarding the question of whether the traditional media, radio, television, and the newspapers and the new media have contributed to the division, 84% of the respondents said both about traditional and new media that it contributes to the division. And we have here with us Dr. Tehilla Shwartz, Altshuler, Senior Fellow and Head of Democracy in the Information Aid at the Israel Democracy Institute, Israel Bachar, Strategic Consultant for Political Campaigns, and Carole Nuriel, Director of the ADL, Israel Segal, founder of Connex. We have heard here that in the past also that Rabin and Arlosorov were killed apparently on a political background. The leading publications in the world, and they say the following: when we encounter today views that we disagree with, unlike in the past, we are not in an expanse of disagreement, we are in an emotional expanse of hatred, an emotional response towards the opinion we disagree with. That's the first finding. Second is, what is politics made of? Over the years, politics was made of very small extremes and a lot of people in the center. If there's something we're seeing from the research in the past elections and as well as now, the center is disappearing, and we see this in many surveys as well. In other words, people are moving more to the extremes, one side or the other. And ultimately, we need to understand that in order to have a healthy society, we need a center. We need people who read the front page in the newspaper, who have some kind of a common denominator in terms of their awareness. It's not just the emotional hatred, it's the disappearance of the center. Do you share this feeling that in the United States, I saw those surveys that the common denominator is disappearing? Not only is it disappearing, but what we are talking about here today is a human mechanism that is very simple, in which generally negative information about certain populations is immediately translated into a negative approach and creates delegitimization of certain groups in society. That's what fake news does in society. I read a Pew survey that 62% of Americans consume their news mostly on the social media, especially Facebook. 90% of millennials read their news on Facebook, but that's circumstantial. But now let's look at the next figure. 82% of high school students in the United States don't know how to distinguish between reliable news and fake news. So what we're seeing is a process that has two layers. We rely on the social media to build a mindset, and our ability to distinguish between truth and lies is decreasing, and that's a very dangerous process on a social level. There are two things that we need to note here. Why does the consumption of news and social media encourage fake news? Why does fake news encourage hatred? It's fake. So we should perhaps look at two levels. Not everything creates hatred. There are the characteristics of the digital. We're in front of a screen rather than in front of a human being. We have this kind of online inhibitions. We can type things that we wouldn't say to people. This is the shaming. People say things on the telephone they wouldn't say to them face to face. That's one thing. And the second thing is what we call the echo chambers, those places where, because the algorithm wants money, because the algorithm wants engagement, it creates a situation where we are in places where emotionally they incite hatred, places where we agree with or that are extreme. Forget about politics. If you've gone into Facebook and YouTube, you went in as a vegetarian, you'll come out as a vegan. If you came in as a runner of short distance, you'll come out as a marathon dancer. You're constantly exposed to more content that is more and more extreme, and that's where the hate problem arises. To that is joined the problem of fake news, and the ones that profit from that is that we don't rely on ourselves to find out what the truth is and what isn't true. So who can we rely on? We don't trust the government, right? So we trust our Facebook friends. And those Facebook friends, they are the source because they're the ones who can be manipulated. Sometimes it's fake accounts, and sometimes it's bots, and sometimes it's just, and they are networks that constantly reverberate the same thing. So sometimes it will cause me to buy certain things on Amazon. And if I am a young voter, then I may choose a more extreme party because that's what I think all the people around me are doing. I'd like to add one thing to what Tehilla said. Everyone today can create fake news. You don't have to be an expert in technology. You can write a WhatsApp a message in a way that it will convince people that it's very authoritative, and people will pass it around a lot. So everyone has the ability to do it, but then you have the interest and the technology and the psychological sensitivity to sensational news. So there's the recipe for what's happening now. I saw in the past weekend a fascinating thing. There was a feature on Friday Night News about the exceptions committee, and then Mary Rega said that it's fake news, and then they said she was fake, and they did away with the committees. Is there an objective way to find out what's truth and who's spreading a truth and who's spreading fake, or have we lost that ability? Are we in a completely subjective expanse? First of all, there is a truth. There is truth. There is objective truth, but it's on the defensive. There are organizations that check facts. There are research institutes and research, and ultimately it comes to an individual, and you decide. But you say this research institute is funded by so and so, so I don't believe it. Ultimately, it comes down to us, to our own personal decision. Let me correct you that I believe that the person who did a more manipulative approach. I'm not sure it's exactly that way, because today the networks have also internalized that there are lies and that they can check them, and they have an obligation under certain conditions to use fact checkers. Israel Bachar is an expert on campaigns. Let me ask you, to what extent is fake news used by politicians and campaigns? First of all, rifting and polarization are tools of political campaigns unconnected to social media. You can create the polarization to create dichotomy between the audiences. Right and left, of course, creates polarization. Regarding fake news, yes, it is a tool that gives you the ability more than to move people from one side to another, but to deepen their belief in their own path, in their own camp. That's where it works very well. We see it in the United States, not only online, but let's take, for example, Fox News. Fox News works on that mechanism. They strengthen the beliefs of their own target audience, not anybody else. Fake news is the most effective in strengthening your own audience. Is it able to change the views of the opposite audience? In some cases, yes, but in most cases, no. It depends where you are on that continuum of support for your camp. It definitely can impact people who are in the center, who are undecided to a certain extent. and it can impact their views to a certain extent. So definitely it is a tool. Could we have a peek into a meeting that you may or may not have participated where somebody says, let's spread something and we'll throw it very far away so it doesn't stick to us? How is it done? In every planning with fake news too, there's seven different levels of fake news. It starts with the use of some kind of satirical piece, or to the complete fake news or a lie. For example, in a blue and white campaign, they used an element, Likud used an element against Gantz, and they edited and they added other elements, and they created a very effective network campaign. And like the Crooked Hillary campaign, it's not the same thing completely. That's a somewhat different story. They took something and they edited and they put in captions, but I don't get the impression that that means that he's not a capable candidate, or he's in the classic blue and white audience, it didn't have an impact, but there were people who hadn't yet completely formed their opinion. When you're undecided, you're much more subject to being influenced. That's the low level, yes. But on the extreme level, there is, let's take Trump, for example. When he says they stole our elections, that's the seventh level. It's a complete lie, and his audience believed it. And we saw the results on January 6th in the Capitol. But sometimes it can boomerang against you. So it depends on the situation of the campaign. And the campaigner, what does he do? Okay, let's plan how to do this in the most effective way, and to hell with the public? Or do they say, look, party head or prime minister, we have our boundaries. Are there things that won't be done? Absolutely. You have to understand that fake news can have a very high price for you too. But that's instrumental. That's not in terms of values. Yes, of course. You have to decide what's effective and what's not effective. Ultimately, there are rules. Everyone has their own rules. And I talk about myself. There are things that I would never do. The end does not justify the means at any price. Where are you on those seven? You go up to 5, up to 3? And I think 2. What is 2? You can define it as spin. Sometimes you take a certain element and you define it a little bit differently in terms of the media or the mindset. That's what we do in the media all day, every day. In other words, you create a different context. I look at that in the view of persuasion rather than fake. In other words, it's persuasion, not misleading. Yes. Can you give us an example? There's endless examples. It's in every campaign. Let me give you an example. In the third campaign, we talked about, we called it File 5000, that the health system is not prepared, and it had nothing to do with the coronavirus, and it came from a different world, and we gave it content, we labeled it belonging to the health system. So it took on certain content that wasn't issue-oriented at all, it was personality-oriented. And the framing that we created took it to other places against Netanyahu at that time. So that's an example of something that you do that can be considered legitimate.
Do you agree? Well, yes and no. I think you can define it in different ways. Fake news has various definitions, and I would divide it into 3 types. The first type is fake news that creates damage, causes damage, a lie that causes damage, or disinformation, as they call it. The second is fake news that is misinformation, which is fake news that is fake. It's false, but it's not meant to harm. It's just I heard something and I got something wrong, and then a whole kind of thing happened. So the first one is malicious. Yes, it's with an intent to harm. And then the third one is something I thought of recently, where it's become a method, a system It's not just something anecdotal, something that you frame to reach a certain or to achieve something. It's just a method that I use in order to get from A to B, an instrument that I use. I can go this way, but I can also have a method that will be based on many little lies. I think the best um, example is the disinformation or the intervention between states in election campaigns, in presidential elections 2016, for example, where there's a method, there's a whole system in place where a person comes to a situation where they decide, let's say they want to win elections or they want to hurt a certain person or they want to go into a certain position, I will actually make this a system to reach my goal. Maybe we can also add, just for a moment, to what Arik said, which of course is true. We need to distinguish between two things. First of all, the content. Content can be a lie, can be not a lie, can be half a lie, can be a spin. But what is so characteristic or typical of digital is the ways of distributing health, distributing falsehood. If you create an avatar, if you create a whole network that makes me hear a message that may not be fake news, maybe it's genuine, but I hear it from everywhere, so how can I not believe it? That's what it's all about. We have an ability, a huge ability, not only to create fake news, but also to distribute it with fake news methods. And if we don't understand that, we won't understand this entire ecosystem and why it happened. Because when we talk about a method, a system, it's not just the content. Content, we can certainly argue about. Two politicians can say, one will say they see reality one way, the other will say they see it a different way. But how can we know what's true and what's not when you see the methods that are used in order to distribute these messages? That's when you understand that the real aim, the real goal is not only to lie to the public, it's deeper. It's actually to undermine our trust in our ability to even find out whether it's right or not. And we are swamped. We are like sponges that are so saturated with water that we're saying, okay, whatever will be. And that's where the danger lies, not even the uh, lie. I think we're sponges full of really sewer water, unfortunately, but our inability, the ordinary person's inability to not understand what's right and what's not, was born with the internet. The fact that I can take every headline and just, explore it deeply, I have no time for that. No one does. So therefore, I am used by campaigners and lobbyists and always lose. Yes, because we keep telling ourselves that we have to be responsible and we have to find out the truth. But what would happen if you were to have a platter full of the most delicious desserts in the world? Would we be able to resist it? It's just like that. We are constantly being given all kinds of messages. Some of them are, wrapped in shiny packages, and we're expected to resist them. It's very hard. Yes, that's when you're vegan. You say, okay, it's got eggs in it, I can resist it. Okay, so Tehilla said before about the difference with the way in the way a person speaks to another person or types. So let's say that about publics. There are certain sentiments online that we hear in certain sectors. What do you think? I think there is certainly a correlation between what happens in real life and what happens in the media. There is a balance between them. Many times we see groups that are persecuted in reality, they're also persecuted in the media. This identity-based hatred is very common, but it's in the media, but it's also common the in reality. 2 years ago in Massachusetts, there was an incident where flyers were distributed saying that the Holocaust was fake news. It was distributed by the Aryan Brotherhood. And then we hear it also on the digital. Yes, you had to go back to 2 years to get a real example. But if you want a digital example, you can go to 20 seconds ago, not 2 years ago. Well, in our reports, we see that this is always increasing. Over the last 12 months, we see that identity-based targeting in the United States has become a phenomenon in percentages that are really high, above 70% in all sorts of minorities. Another thing I want to say is that there is a kind of border, there's a kind of boundary that we have to set. We are not there to, on the one hand, to explore the truth. There are some things that we know are the truth, and yet the social media is full of theories where people believe the truth, not because they have an agenda, but because they have been so convinced. Let's say denying the Holocaust. So you talked about the stages, the 7 stages. Here too, there are stages, and still they're so dangerous. There's something that's called partial Holocaust denial. I didn't say it didn't happen. It did happen, but the numbers aren't exactly accurate, like the Jews are saying. It's not really uh, gas chambers, because otherwise there wouldn't be grass there in Auschwitz now. So a reasonable person on the street who doesn't know history the way we do will say, is it true or is it not? And that's when we have to ask ourselves, whose job is it to really judge? Once a person is asking, that's already means we have lost, because that's all they want to do. They just want to undermine, you know? It's just a matter of doubt. Yes, but this doubt is our best tool for discovering the truth, because if I find a fake that's fake and I stop and I don't share it because I say, wait, maybe it's a lie, I've done something. So maybe it's philosophical. You talked about distrust. We don't trust experts, judges, scientists, physicians, journalists, politicians. I only listen to my friend from Facebook. But on the other hand, we want to tell people, no, it's the fake news you shouldn't believe. It's very difficult to distinguish between the two, and we've seen it. We saw it coming to our face here in Israel, because it's the forces in Israeli politics that for years have been undermining our trust in the media, in the academia, because they're all leftists, in undermining the authority of the courts. Now they're saying, don't listen to the fake news about vaccinations. Why? Because why wouldn't we? It's exactly the same process. So if we now look, and we're going to talk about social media in a minute, but if we look at the impact of COVID on our lives, and maybe to be a dramatic, but on history, it'll be here in this point, because COVID taught us that fake news can endanger our lives. It doesn't always it doesn't just create hatred and polarization. It can really, you know, impact and endanger our lives. And that's when we have to ask ourselves whose job it is to discern what's true and what's not. Who is distributing these fake news? It's not just these people, it's not just the Russians and the Iranians, it's our own politicians, it's our own institutionalized media outlets. It is people sitting, not Telegram, I'm talking about the social media, 4chan, HN, Gab, Parley, all of these social media platforms, these places that together create the information ecosystem, the institutionalized media, alternative media, all different social media, institutionalized and otherwise, all of this together creates our information ecosystem. And here, COVID came and really placed a mirror in front of us. Israel, do you agree? Or maybe let me rephrase the question. Does having doubt, does casting doubt, or let's say the people who keep saying deep state, should they wonder then that why people don't want to get vaccinated? Absolutely. In the United States, by the way, it's exactly connected. Somehow here in Israel, it's become two separate groups, but certainly they're interconnected. Excuse me, Asail. Certainly, I think that once a process begins whereby a mechanism's trust is broken, particularly when they're official mechanisms, at the end of the day, distrust is then across the board. You can't say, I'm going to stop with distrust here and not go there with it. And that's why distrust in systems at large, but particularly in the media, creates a situation where there are no more gatekeepers saying what's true and what's not, what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. And that's exactly where this ecosystem is becoming a paradise for all of these fake news distributors. Okay, so we're going backwards or inwards or downwards in this process. We've talked about the damage we see on the surface. Let's delve a little deeper and talk about the institutionalized media that Tehilla has mentioned. We have seen how in the United States, the institutionalized media began to do fake check, act on live in retrospect. Is journalism, is the media, is the press, getting on top of it, or are we far from it? We're still far from it. I think we're still far from it. I remember that when I studied in the United States in 20 years, in the New York and MSNBC, in the New York Times, and it took fact checking, it took 20 years to come here. And the wave is already very big. And the fact-checking, this process is only just beginning here. So there's a huge gap. I think that once it became a trend, let's say now, if there'll be a few channels and they'll want to do it, everyone will want to be there. And if they're saying, okay, if everyone's already there, let's do it here as well. I think it'll again make a problem because the fact you're going to have to start fact checking the fact checking. And sometimes people are saying, who are you to decide? It's a political opinion, and my opinion is the opposite. Well, my idea is to work with the people and to educate people, to try and understand what could be true and what could not be true. And it's very difficult. Is it possible? I think so. I'm optimistic. I see it in my work. It works. I see people who undergo a course. They learn about algorithms and filters and echo chambers and the interests of people and the technological companies' interests. And when they get something, suddenly they say, wait, let's check the source. Is it fake? Let's see what's happening around us. Maybe it's related to the fact that there's a campaign, an elections campaign, so maybe it's fake. And they get a place that's better than where we are now. And I think that if these methods will be incorporated into the education system, we'll also be in a better place. And in Finland, I think they've already done it and they've seen good results. That's what I've seen, perhaps in other places as well. Yes, but we have to say two things. First of all, I completely agree with what Arik just said, but we have to say two things. First of all, okay, so let's go to the education system. In 25 years' time, we'll have citizens with a high media orientation. It is the adults who distribute fake news the most. There are studies that show it, that the best predictor for distributing fake news is not political opinion and not a level of education, it's age. So we call it the mother-in-law test on a WhatsApp group. Who sends the most, nonsense? And this is a very important question because just like the elderly community, the older community are more exposed to liars that are selling them, hacks online or on the phone. They are also the ones distributing it. And these networks, like WhatsApp networks, WhatsApp is a network that you don't know what happens on. It's not like Facebook, which is more public and open. And I want to say something about fact checking as well. Fact checking is very good in theory, but in practice, it is not very successful. First of all, because it's been said now, everyone is fact checking the fact checking, but also, and that's what we really should place our finger on. When we fact check something and say it's a lie, we've put it into the networks, but what does the network algorithm do? It sees that I am referring to this false content again and again. But if I've mentioned this content, the algorithm is saying, oh, it's a good content because there's engagement around it. So let's distribute it again. So we're actually trying to put out this fire using oil. I would say something half responsibly. There was a huge experiment surrounding the American elections. We know what the social media did and we know what happened. We saw that at the end of the day, only once Trump was out of Twitter, half of the fake news distributed there went down. And that raises really horrible thoughts because what, we're going to stop politicians from expressing their opinion? But whatever else they did beforehand, they marked, they stopped sharing, it didn't help. So we can talk about fact checking all we like. At the end of the day, if there are a few sort of super distributors of fake news, they are the ones that create most of the noise, and it's probably only treating them that will help. So what are you saying? At the end of the day, Twitter and Facebook's decision to block Trump hurts you, but you're 51% in favor of it. It was effective, let's say. I can't say whether I'm happy about it, but effectively speaking, it was effective. And it makes us really honestly ask ourselves, wait, should we continue to do things that are nice democratically but are ineffective? Or should we start doing things that are perhaps not very nice democratically but very effective? Imagine, of course, what we've done over COVID. There are many things that people are saying, okay, look, forego your rights, waive your rights, because I don't even know what to say normatively speaking, but it's important for me to place this on the table because at the end of the day, there was an experiment done here in the United States elections to see what works and what doesn't. Yes, but the reason he was blocked on Twitter and also Khamenei later is not because he distributed fake news specifically, but because he incited for violence. That was the reason. And I think in that respect, if the networks would really have wanted to combat fake news, they could have made changes not only in policy but in the product itself. A product that can identify the fact that Tehilla only resonates a message that we saw before, and it doesn't really believe in it. Like you said, if I resonated, I am part of this distribution chain. A good product will be able to identify the more passive distributors and those who are really more active, and that's where we should be headed, and not just policy making. Yes, I'd like to add, and I think that the people who are missing in these discussions in our forums are the platform people. We have to bring them in. Of course, there's regulation, there is the fight against it, but at the end of the day, let's bring them in because they're the ones who are going to decide. Let's try to work together with them because it is a shared interest to stop and block these lies. Well, let me say very cautiously, I am an Israeli citizen and not a Facebook citizen. It is the state of Israel that should protect me, not Facebook. But we see Facebook, of course, is a code name for all the platforms. Yes, all the social media platforms. And we've seen it in the American elections. There is a global democratic threat in legislation that will limit these platforms. Privacy, size, fake news, political advertising, and so on. So what are the platforms are now saying? You know, they're, they're saying, okay, legislate these laws. Tell us what the framework is. We will work within them. But it is the states themselves, the countries themselves that are unable to make these laws. We are worried to make a law against fake news because who's going to decide what's fake and what's not? Okay, before we fall into this trap, let's talk about the price that we are paying. And this price is shared by us as a nation, but to all nations and to every citizen watching us individually. Why? Because our viewers are saying, okay, it's an election campaign. They're throwing mud at each other. At the end, after the elections, everything will relax. So what? So what's happened? Who cares? What kind of price have we paid? But can you tell us, Carole, what price is social society and social democracy paying for all this energy, for all these dynamics of distributing hatred, polarization, fake news through social media? I'll tell you something that doesn't only have to do with social media, but also with the society we live in. When there are well embedded hatred mechanisms in a society, it doesn't just hurt a certain sector that's targeted. It is like a compass that moves from one sector to another. It's hurt you today, it'll hurt me tomorrow. We see it in Jewish communities. Where there is anti-Semitism, there's also Islamophobia, there is bigotry. Hatred is a social phenomenon that is not limited, it's boundaryless, it always finds another target. And we see it also on social media, and that's why we must ask ourselves, what is the in-depth solution that we are proposing? Because the social price that we are paying for distribution of fake news, I will say, in the simplest way, is complete delegitimization. Someday, one day of me, one day of you, one day of someone else. Okay, so we'll talk about solutions in a minute. When we talked in the other election campaign about the Arabs going to vote. So that's what we see, digitalization of entire sectors, the ultra-Orthodox, the Arab, entire sectors. All of these, who are they and not us. Talk to me about democracy. In what sense is democratic society losing? Who are you talking to, me? Both of you. Well, let's talk about three layers. The first layer is what we saw in the elections in the United States now in 2020. Words, conviction, acts, actions. At the end of the day, much of the violence in the Western world in recent years started in social media, whether it's massacres, whether it's terrorism against Jews in synagogues, or whether it's what happened on Capitol Hill. It's very hard to stop these incidents in real time. From words to actions, the law enforcement authorities don't know what to do in between. And I'm telling you very seriously, our wonderful law enforcement of the startup nation here in Israel in real time couldn't stop something that starts with go to and then ends in violence. It's very hard for the authorities. It's very hard for the the Central Elections Committee. It's even for the Israel Security Agency, the Shabak. It's hard for them to do. It's hatred on the social media. And yes, it's disgusting to be in a world where you're harassed for being a woman, you're harassed for being gay. It's disgusting. It's a place we spend many hours of the day in the digital media. And as I've said, we don't know who to believe anymore. And all three layers are threats to democracy. Finding out the truth, hatred, that's very important. And I want to add that to the separation we undergo as a nation. We see it in the United States, but in Israel, we have similar processes in place from two very like adjacent hills, shall we say, of right and left. We're coming apart. We're actually getting further away from each other. I don't think democracy as a regime will be able to defend itself in a different way. I am very concerned about the younger generation because we are all about the same age sitting here around the table. Speak for yourself. By the way, it's my birthday today. Congratulations. If I'm looking at my young daughters, they don't know the world the way we do. They don't know a world with criticism, with a reporter that is reliable and credible and tells you what's right and what's true and what's not. They don't have these filters anymore, and it's very concerning because, as far as they're concerned, they immediately go into a world where the social media, as Carole said, is their source of information, their first and foremost, sometimes exclusive source of information. And that's what's so concerning because they don't have the tools and capabilities today to understand how to cope with all this information and all the fake news. Now, in recent years, people are saying education is the most important thing, but I think here it's not a cliche. There's Neil Postman, who was a doctor who wrote about the impacts or the negative impacts of television in NYU. And I think that today, if you take his books and you multiply them by 500, you'll see the damage caused by social media. The only way is to create critical thinking, to develop critical thinking among children. And the education system and we as parents must instill that in them because the inability to create a deep, broad shared database is a problem, is a danger. I want to, throw a grenade here and then run away. Who distributes more fake news, left wing or right wing? Intuitively, in Israel, we say right wing, and the same is said in the United States. But I want to give you an example that the left wing in the 1990s, in the first campaigns against Netanyahu, also distributed a lot of fake news against him. And I think over the last 10 years, electorally speaking, the right wing is stronger, so it creates more such contact. What is the scientific academic truth? I don't know. Intuitively, I think, look, 60% of the public is right wing. So, you know, in terms of quantity, they create more content online. So intuitively, I think the right wing, I don't think it, but I don't know if it's scientific. I will take the grenade you threw and I will say it doesn't matter. Because as long as someone gains from the distribution of fake news, they're there to stay. And it doesn't matter if they're right wing or left wing. That's not the question. Who stands to gain from this engagement? Who stands to gain from this attention? Who stands to gain from the way social media works these days? That's the question. And then I ask myself, why don't we join forces? Why don't we join forces left and right and combat this? I don't argue with you, but when people want to give an example of fake news, they use an example from Bibi with the Arabs in the ballot boxes. They use the dogs video from Yadut Torah, which, by the way, is a huge lie. So it's right wing that is usually used for examples. Netanyahu started his political life in Israel. So 25 years backwards, you want an example from today? There's fake news against different people in the right as well. I want to see it. Just 3 minutes on the phone and I'll find an example for you. I'll do something a bit dirty, just like you did now. In the left sphere, there are many more pandemic deniers than in the right wing. So this kind of fake news, of course, goes around there. So human nature is the same. And when you have these beautiful desserts in front of you, you act the same way. The right wing in Israel, or at least the right wing parties in Israel, like the Likud, are much more sophisticated digitally. They are far beyond the other parties. It's in their, it's something that we can say to their credit. But there's someone who is building an economy around the fake news? Who stands to gain? That's the question. And how can we as a society, limit them? There are some kinds of populations that you can't target with certain messages because you know that you're building on their sensitivities, on their emotions. There are some kinds of content, as Carole said, that even in our postmodern world, we say they are beyond our scope. They like really extreme conspiracies, like pandemic denial, like Holocaust denial. We as a society can draw the line and say, beyond that, it's unacceptable. When we say everyone's corrupt, it means no one's corrupt. If we say everything's true, it means nothing's true. We as a society are allowed to say we have the tools to explore the truth, to discern the truth, and we create the limits. It's very difficult. It's all dangerous, and it's true. But to say because of that everything is acceptable, we cannot allow that. Okay, I think we have marked whether it's sometimes the politicians, sometimes it's the commercial companies and brands, it's always the social platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, because the more engagement, the better. Let's talk about steps as we conclude. Arik and Carole, what would you propose we should do in order to deal with this problem? S'il vous plaît. Thank you. First of all, critical thinking in education, informal education, informal education. When we talk about opinion leaders, digital journalists, people who have Twitter accounts, they are the loudspeakers. They pass the information on these influencers and social media influencers, and the ways of critical thinking. When people start using them and employing them, they'll start believing them because they will see these social media influencers as their kind of role models. So it's talking with them, it's working with them, it's working with community managers, digital community managers, creative ways like gaming. I'm working on it. Through gaming, the kids will have to learn what's fake and what's not. It's like training, right? It's like training to discover fake news. Yes, also on the regulatory levels, I think the technological companies should be involved, even if there's a clash. Let's hear them and let's see if they want to or not. And then there's regulation, which is a bit too much for me. I think that what you said now is very important. If a child leaves school after 12 years, they know a lot of facts that he's been taught at school, but he has no ability to know whether the fact that he's been given is true or not, is fake or not. So what's the use of school? What's the use of school? Yes, especially in this medium that's always in front of them. As an educational organization, we truly believe in educating kids to critical thinking and to knowing all these options online and how we measure what's true and what's not as much as we can. But let's not also cut, sort of cut too much slack to for these platforms. I think that they should be more responsible, and I think that they're slowly beginning to understand that. YouTube has taken off the Louis Farrakhan accounts. So we know that these platforms can undergo a kind of thinking process whereby they're saying this is okay and this is not okay. I think they can do so much more. For instance, transparency. Tell us, give us a glimpse into how you classify hate posts. Another thing that you can do is changes in products, all kinds of algorithms that automatically identify these things. And the third thing is that they can also intervene. We have asked the platforms, and we had a huge campaign in the summer called Stop Hate for Profit, and that aimed to ask corporations to stop advertising on Facebook because of the amount of hate that's distributed there. So we came with these claims to Facebook, and also, for example, to give a content moderator on groups of 150 people, political groups, someone who will help them see what's right and what's not, exactly for these things. So these companies have responsibility, and it is our responsibility to demand that of them. I think that's interesting. I think many of us feel that it's kind of like, trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. But this campaign was interesting, and we kept covering it. But I think at the end of the day, when ADL came and met with Mark Zuckerberg said okay and went away. Yes, but then 2 months later, a Holocaust denial was defined as a hate crime. So on Facebook, so maybe it helped. Israel, do you think there's a way to force or to harness politicians to this change as part of these, fake news and atmosphere distributors? Let's stop with this poison. Or do they always stand to gain because, the more negative you are and the lower you go, you'll gain more? Politicians are very sensitive to this common notion that what you do and what you don't do. If it'll have an electoral price, that's where it'll end. So it's instrumental and it's always productivity. But I want to speak this to what Carole said. I think that what could perhaps impact this craziness is one, strong regulation, two, critical thinking, education, and three, our generation, the older generation, who must become a um, a strong group, but not only against the distributors, because that's really emptying the ocean with a spoon. I don't need to go down to the smallest distributor, but against these huge companies that at the end of the day are able, through algorithms and through knowledge, to manipulate the network to make money. And we have to ask ourselves whether we, as parents and as society, don't have a role to play. They need to be impacted, because if they're not stopped, if they don't pay a price, they won't stop. Roadblocks is a company that's being launched today and or this week, and this company is basically kids who are making games for each other. And this could be a platform that could be, a platform that could be that people could use to exploit or for sexual abuse or all sorts of things like that. And suddenly it's clean, strangely, and I think it's now actually getting an IPO. So what do you think? So we have elections, and now what's going to happen when there are 120 new people in the Knesset? Well, there is the holy um, there's education, technological tools, and regulation. That's the three-way street, and we need to use these companies. We need to treat these companies. We need to treat the world of privacy and targeting. These messages are not just out there. They are they target people. We have to ask ourselves: do we, as a society, as a community, want to set rules that aim to delete content if there is true harm done? We need to create a playground also for elections and political advertising, because the people in the election campaigns care a lot about what people think of them. But we know that, but they know that under the radar, they can do whatever they want, because the rules of the game are not strong enough. You're playing soccer without rules. So we need to look at um, traps that we're falling into. If we talk about fakes and avatars and fake accounts and bots, we'll be able to start this conversation that will serve us between elections. I must admit that I'm not optimistic, because the amount of work that we have to do and the amount of time required, it means that when we finish this work in 5-6 years, the playground will be somewhere else. Well, in the past, we thought people will never stop smoking, and they've managed to do it, so let's be optimistic. I think that even when if there is, I think that a strong economic incentive will help. Carole, Arik, Tehilla, and Israel, I would like to thank you so much for this panel. You have given us so much food for thought about social media and the real world.